The morning Emma Merritt was supposed to become the happiest woman in Harlan County, Texas. She was instead left standing at the altar with 200 pairs of eyes burning holes straight through her white dress, and not a single person in the territory moved to help her, except for one quiet, broad-shouldered cowboy in the back pew who had never once spoken a word to her in his life. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Caldwell Creek sat nestled between two limestone bluffs in a bend of the Guadalupe River, where the mesquite grew thick, and the sky spread wide and indifferent above everything. The town was not large, but it was proud, and it held its social occasions with the kind of gravity that smaller communities reserve for things that matter most: a good harvest, a bad drought, a birth, a death, and a wedding. On this particular Saturday in April, the wedding of Miss Emma Merritt to Mr. Gerald Hutchins had drawn more people than the Christmas service. Gerald Hutchins was the son of the territory's largest landowner, Aldous Hutchins, and Emma Merritt was the schoolteacher's daughter, pretty and capable and gentle in a way that made people feel calmer just by being near her. It was considered by all of Caldwell Creek to be a fine match. Emma had spent the better part of 6 months believing it herself. She stood now in the doorway of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell Creek, her bouquet of bluebonnets and wild prairie roses trembling slightly in her gloved hands, the organ playing a hymn that seemed to grow louder with every moment. Gerald did not appear at the end of the aisle. Reverend Calloway stood at the pulpit looking uncomfortable in a way only a man of God can look when the divine order of things seems to have gone sideways. The guests shifted in their pews. Fans waved against the April heat. Somewhere in the middle rows, a baby whimpered, and its mother shushed it with the kind of frantic urgency usually reserved for something far more serious. Emma's mother, Margaret Merritt, stood just behind her daughter's left shoulder, her face fixed in an expression that was trying very hard to be serene and achieving something closer to controlled panic. Her father, Harold Merritt, had already stepped back from her right side and was now speaking in low, urgent tones to Sheriff Dobbs near the church door, and Emma could catch only fragments. Gerald's horse, not at the stable, been since last night. Aldous Hutchins not answering either. She understood what it meant before anyone said it plainly. The organ stopped. Reverend Calloway cleared his throat. Someone in the back of the church coughed. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Emma had ever heard in her 24 years of living, louder than any Texas thunderstorm, louder than the cattle drives that shook the ground in the fall. It pressed against her from every direction, that silence, full of pity and second-hand embarrassment, and the particular cruelty of being witnessed at your worst moment by absolutely everyone who has ever known your name. "It appears," Reverend Calloway began, his voice careful as a man walking ice, "that we may need to." He did not finish, because at that moment the church door banged open behind Emma and Gerald Hutchins walked in, and for one brief, trembling second, Emma felt her whole body sag with relief so profound it nearly took her legs out from under her. She turned. Gerald was there, tall, fair-haired, wearing his good suit, but he was not alone. There was a woman beside him, small and dark-haired and pale as milk, in the doorway, and Gerald's hand was at the small of her back in a way that was unmistakable and damning and instant. The church took in one collective breath. Gerald stopped when he saw Emma. He had the decency to look stricken, which was something, though Emma would not think of it that way for a very long time. His mouth opened. He said her name. He said it the way a man says a name when he knows he has done something irreparable, and the only honest response to the situation is to say the person's name and wait for the world to decide what happens next. "Emma," he said. I owe you." "Don't," Emma said. Her voice was quiet and very steady, which surprised her, because nothing else in her body was steady. Her hands had stopped trembling only because they had gone rigid. Her chest felt like something had reached inside it and rearranged the furniture. But her voice was steady, and she held on to that. "Don't," she said again, and then she did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say to a man who had brought his other woman to your wedding. The silence in the church had become something physical. 200 people sat frozen, some with their mouths partially open, some staring at their laps, some watching with the helpless fascination of people who know they are witnessing something they will be telling their grandchildren about. Aldous Hutchins, Gerald's father, had risen from the front pew and was already moving toward his son with the expression of a man prepared to do considerable damage to someone, and it was not entirely clear whether that someone was Gerald or Emma or the dark-haired woman or perhaps all three. Emma turned away from Gerald. She turned back toward the altar, toward Reverend Calloway, toward the 200 people watching her from their pews, and she took one step down the aisle and then stopped, because she did not know where she was going or what came next, or what a woman does when the life she has been preparing for 6 months simply ceases to exist in the span of 30 seconds. The pity in their faces was the worst part. Mrs. Cleary from the dry goods store had her hand pressed over her mouth. The Dawson girls, who had attended Emma's school and been her students just last year, were gripping each other's wrists. Old Tom Patterson in the third pew had turned his hat in his hands and was staring at the floor with the focused attention of a man trying very hard not to look at something he has accidentally seen. And then, from the very back of the church, from the last pew on the left where he had been sitting alone and still as a fence post since the ceremony began, a man stood up. Emma had seen him before, in the way that you see everyone in a small town at the general store at the feed yard, passing on the main street, but she had never spoken to him, not once, not even a good morning across a hitching post. His name was Clayton Barker. He was a rancher who had come to Caldwell Creek about 1.5 years ago and set up on a modest piece of land east of town along the river bend. And he kept mostly to himself in the way that some men do, not from unfriendliness but from some private preference for quiet over noise. He was perhaps 28 or 29, tall with the kind of steady, deliberate build that comes from years of physical labor, with dark hair and a jaw that could have been cut from the same limestone as the bluffs around the river. He had brown eyes, though Emma would not learn that for another hour. He stood up in the back pew, and the movement itself drew every eye in the church. He was the first person to move in what felt like a very long time, and he looked directly at Emma, not with pity, not with that awful second-hand mortification that everyone else was wearing, but with something straightforward and practical, the way a man looks at a situation that needs addressing. "Miss Merritt," he said. His voice carried through the church the way a church voice should, without shouting, without performance. "Let me take you home." The silence shifted. It was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, the kind that follows an unexpected development rather than the kind that follows a disaster, and there is a meaningful difference between the two. Emma looked at him. He held her gaze and did not flinch from it. Around them, 200 people held their breath as one organism. "I don't know you," Emma said. She did not say it unkindly. It was simply the truth, and she was in that moment too exhausted by the morning's events to be anything other than honest. "No, ma'am," Clayton Barker said, "but I've got a wagon outside and I know where your father's house is, and this is a more gracious offer than anything else you're going to get in this room right now." Someone let out a sound that was half laugh and half gasp. Several heads turned toward Gerald Hutchins to see his reaction. Gerald's jaw had tightened. The dark-haired woman beside him had taken a half-step back. Emma Merritt looked at the man in the back pew for one long moment. She thought about pride and about practicality and about the fact that she was wearing a white dress and holding a bunch of bluebonnets and standing in the middle of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell Creek with her whole future in pieces around her feet and 200 witnesses to it. She thought about the fact that her legs had started trembling slightly, which her voice still refused to do. She thought about how desperately she needed to be somewhere other than here. "All right," she said. "Thank you." She walked toward the back of the church. The guests parted without being asked, drawing back to either side of the aisle in a motion that was almost reverent, and Emma Merritt walked the full length of that aisle with her head level and her bouquet still in her hands, and Clayton Barker met her at the door and pushed it open for her, and they walked out of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell Creek together into the brilliant April sunshine, and the door swung shut behind them, and inside the church, the silence finally broke into sound. The wagon was a plain working wagon, the kind used for hauling feed and equipment, with a bench seat worn smooth by years of use. Clayton Barker helped her up without fanfare, offering his hand, and then taking his place on the other side of the bench and gathering the reins. The horse, a solid roan mare with a calm disposition, did not so much as flick her ears when he clicked his tongue and guided her away from the church hitching post. They rode in silence for a minute. The town rolled past them, the barber shop, the telegraph office, the milliners, the wide dusty main street of Caldwell Creek with its hitching posts and its water trough and the smell of horse and dust, and the faint sweetness of something baking in the cafe window. A few people on the sidewalk stopped to watch them pass, and Emma sat straight and looked forward. "I am going to have to thank you properly," she said finally when they had cleared the main street and turned onto the road that wound north toward the Merritt property. "When I am capable of doing it properly, which is not right at this moment." "You don't owe me thanks," Clayton said. He kept his eyes on the road. "I just offered a ride." "You did considerably more than offer a ride," Emma said. "You stood up in front of the whole territory, and—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked out at the mesquite and the early spring bluebonnets that spread in blue drifts along the roadside. "You made it so I could leave," she said finally. "Without it being only a retreat, you made it into something I chose." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair way to put it," he said. They rode on. The Guadalupe glittered through the trees to the west. A pair of sissortails sat on the fence wire and watched them pass. Emma became aware, gradually, that her fingers had released their death grip on the bouquet, and that her shoulders had come down from somewhere near her ears to a more reasonable position. The morning's events were still sitting squarely in the center of her chest, solid and awful, but the immediate suffocating pressure of being watched had lifted, and she could breathe again, which was more than she had been able to say 20 minutes ago. "Did you know," she asked, "about the other woman, about Gerald?" "No," Clayton said. "I knew Hutchins was—" He paused, choosing his words with some care. "I knew he was not a serious man. I did not know the specifics." "How did you know he was not a serious man?" "The way a man treats his horses," Clayton said, "and the way he treats people he doesn't need anything from. You can tell a lot from both." Emma looked at him then, for the first time with real attention rather than the peripheral awareness she had given him in the church. He had a steady profile, a straight nose, a small scar along his left jaw that was old and faded. He wore a plain dark hat and a work shirt and his Sunday vest, and there was something about the combination that suggested he had dressed with some intention for the church service, but without pretension. He held the reins loosely, the way a man holds them when he and the horse have an understanding. "What do you know about me?" she asked, "since you know where my father's house is." "Your father is Harold Merritt, who teaches at the schoolhouse," Clayton said. "Your mother is Margaret, who grows the best kitchen garden in the county by most accounts. You taught the lower grades before your father took sick 2 winters ago. You read on the front porch in the evenings when the weather allows. You take your coffee at the cafe on Thursday mornings. Your horse is a bay gelding named Captain that you ride on Saturdays." Emma stared at him. "That is a considerable amount of information about a woman you have never spoken to." "Caldwell Creek is a small town," Clayton said, and there was something in the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it did not fully arrive. "It is a very small town," Emma agreed. She looked back at the road. "What do people know about you?" "That I bought the old Reeves place east of town," he said. "That I keep longhorns and a few quarter horses. That I mind my own business." "That last one appears to be accurate right up until this morning," Emma said. The almost smile moved slightly further toward completion. "I suppose it does." They reached the Merritt property as the sun was climbing toward 10 o'clock, the light still fresh and golden. It was a modest homestead, a white-painted frame house, a kitchen garden that was indeed remarkable, a small barn, a good well. Emma's mother was already there, having apparently left the church immediately following Emma and taken a faster route with one of the Dawson neighbors, and she appeared in the doorway of the house with the expression of a woman who has been crying and stopped, and is now functioning on pure determined efficiency. Clayton pulled the wagon to a stop and helped Emma down. Margaret Merritt came off the porch and took her daughter's hands and looked at her face the way mothers look when they are trying to determine how bad the damage is. "I'm all right, Mama," Emma said. "I am not all right, but I am standing, which is the important part." "Come inside," Margaret said. "I'll put the kettle on." She looked past Emma to Clayton, who had stood back from the wagon and was holding his hat in his hands. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming something measured and assessing. "Mr. Barker," she said. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "I'm sorry about this morning. You are the only person in Caldwell Creek today who has nothing to be sorry about," Margaret said, with the kind of precision that made it clear she knew exactly who did. "Will you come in for coffee? It is the least I can offer." "I appreciate the offer," Clayton said, "but I don't want to intrude on your family's time. I just wanted to see Miss Merritt safely home." He put his hat back on, nodded to Margaret, and then looked at Emma one final time. His brown eyes were steady and dark and held nothing in them that Emma needed to brace against. No pity, no performance, just a kind of uncomplicated sincerity that she found in that moment extraordinarily restful. "Take care of yourself, Miss Merritt," he said. "I will," she said. "Mr. Barker, truly, thank you." He nodded once more, climbed back onto the wagon bench, and drove east toward his property along the river. Emma stood in the April sunshine and watched the wagon until it disappeared around the bend of the road, and then she went inside and sat down at her mother's kitchen table and finally, quietly, cried. She cried for an hour. Not the spectacular, heaving kind of crying, but the steady, thorough kind that means you are grieving something real, which was not exactly Gerald Hutchins the man. She understood within the first 10 minutes that Gerald Hutchins had never really been the man she thought he was, and that the man she had been in love with was largely a construction she had built herself from insufficient materials. What she was grieving was the life she had arranged in her mind around him. The house, the mornings, the particular shape of an ordinary future, and that was a real thing to grieve, and it deserved an honest hour. After the hour, she washed her face and changed out of the white dress and put on her everyday clothes and went to the kitchen and helped her mother make a proper noon meal. And they talked about practical things with the deliberate focus of women who know that practical things are sometimes the best medicine for impractical pain. Harold Merritt came home at noon, having walked the 2 miles from town because he had ridden in on the horse with their neighbor and did not have his own transportation. And he came into the kitchen and looked at his daughter and said, with the simplicity of a man who has spent his life among words and knows how to choose them, "You are worth 10 of Gerald Hutchins on his best day, Emma, and that is not a father's bias. That is plain arithmetic." Emma hugged him hard and said nothing, which was all that was needed. The days that followed were not easy, but they were navigable. Caldwell Creek was a small town, and small towns have a communal memory that functions rather like a flock of birds. It turns as one unit, all at once, in whatever direction the current moment points. For a day or two, the current pointed at Emma Merritt and her disaster of a wedding morning, and she felt it in the careful way people spoke to her at the dry goods store and the 2 bright smiles from the Dawson girls when she passed on the street. But then Aldous Hutchins, in a fury at his son's behavior, cut Gerald's inheritance by half and sent him and his companion packing to San Antonio, and the current turned sharply toward that considerably more dramatic development, and Emma Merritt receded from the center of everyone's attention to somewhere more comfortable at the periphery. She resumed her life. She helped her father at the schoolhouse 3 days a week, since his health still would not allow him to manage alone. She tended the kitchen garden with her mother. She read on the porch in the evenings, a habit she had maintained since she was 12 and which no quantity of heartbreak could interrupt. She took her coffee at the cafe on Thursday mornings because she had earned that small ritual, and she was not going to surrender it to embarrassment. It was on the second Thursday that she saw Clayton Barker again. He was coming out of the feed store as she was walking from the cafe back toward the schoolhouse, and they nearly collided at the corner of Main and River Street, and he caught the door with one hand and stepped back to allow her through, and their eyes met with the mutual recognition of people who have shared something significant and are now navigating the question of what that means in the ordinary world. "Miss Merritt," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Barker," she said. "How are you?" "Well enough," he said. "And yourself?" "Considerably better than the last time you saw me," she said. "I imagine so," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way it had, not quite a smile but the honest ancestor of one. She hesitated. She was not a woman who hesitated much. Her mother had raised her with a directness that was sometimes mistaken for boldness and was really just efficiency. But she hesitated now because what she wanted to say required some navigation. "I want to say properly what I said improperly in the wagon," she said. "What you did at the church it was not a small thing. I know you said it was just a ride, but it was the difference between me leaving and me being left, and I want you to know that I am very aware of that difference and very grateful for it." He looked at her steadily. "You would have left on your own," he said. "You had the look of a woman who was going to move whether or not anyone offered her a reason to." "Perhaps," Emma said, "but having a reason made it better. Having a reason made it a choice." He nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad I could offer one." A pause opened between them, not uncomfortable, more like a space that was considering what to put in itself. "I don't suppose you'd care for coffee," Emma said. "Since you're in town and I'm heading back past the cafe, as a proper thank you since I've now said it twice without actually following through on the offer." He shifted his weight, looked briefly at the feed store behind him, then back at her. Something crossed his face that might have been surprise, quickly organized into its more composed form. "I believe I could manage coffee," he said. They went back to the cafe, which was a small, warm room run by a woman named Dora Blaine, who made an excellent pie and minded her business with admirable discipline. And they sat at the table by the window with the April light coming through the glass, and they drank coffee and talked for an hour. And it was the kind of conversation that happens when two people discover, with some mutual surprise, that they find each other interesting. Emma learned that Clayton Barker had grown up in East Texas, near a place called Jefferson, the son of a farmer who had also ranched some cattle on the side. That he had worked cattle drives up from South Texas for 3 years in his early 20s, which explained the particular quality of his stillness and his self-sufficiency. Men who work long drives develop a relationship with their own company that marks them permanently. That he had come to Caldwell Creek because he had found the land along the river bend at a price that made sense, and because he had wanted a place that was his own, by which he meant the particular kind of his own that has nothing to do with other people's opinions or expectations. Clayton learned that Emma Merritt had been educated beyond what was common for women in the territory, thanks to a father who believed knowledge was not gendered and a mother who agreed with him. That she had taught school for 3 years before her father's illness required her to step in for him, and that she loved the work with a completeness that surprised even her sometimes. That she had agreed to marry Gerald Hutchins partly because she had genuinely cared for him as she understood him, and partly because she was 24 in 1882, and the window for choosing rather than accepting was understood by everyone, including Emma herself, to be finite and narrowing. "I don't think that's true," Clayton said when she said this last part. Emma looked at him. "I think you may underestimate the social arithmetic of being a woman of a certain age in a Texas town," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't think the window is as narrow as they'd have you believe. I think some of the women who came through the narrowest part of it ended up exactly where they needed to be." That is either very wise or very convenient, Emma said, depending on your perspective. He met her eyes over his coffee cup. What's your perspective this morning? He asked. She considered. This morning, she said, I think it might be a little of both. They left the cafe shortly after, parting on the sidewalk with the slightly altered quality of people who have just become something more than strangers. And Emma walked back toward the schoolhouse thinking about his brown eyes and the way he listened to her when she talked, not in the manner of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but in the manner of a man genuinely interested in what she was saying, which was, she had found, considerably rarer than it ought to be. The following week, Clayton Barker appeared at the schoolhouse door in the late afternoon, after the students had gone, with a book in his hand. It was a copy of Roughing It by Mark Twain, published a decade earlier, which Emma had mentioned in passing at the cafe as something she had always meant to read and never gotten around to. He held it out to her through the doorway with the matter-of-fact simplicity of a man delivering a useful item. I finished it last winter, he said. Thought you might want it. Emma took the book and looked at it and then looked at him. Thank you, she said. Would you like to come in? I was just finishing the afternoon's preparations. He came in and sat in one of the student desks, too small for him, so that he had the slightly comic look of a large man folded into small furniture, and watched her finish chalking tomorrow's arithmetic lesson on the board, and they talked about books, and about education, and about the way the territory was changing as more families came west and more towns grew up along the river and the railroad pushed further in every year. Do you think Caldwell Creek will grow? Emma asked. It'll grow, Clayton said. Whether that's good or not depends on what it grows into. Most people would say growth is always good. Most people haven't watched a good piece of country get ruined by too much of a good thing, he said. Emma set down her chalk and turned to look at him. You love this land, she said. It was not a question. This particular piece of it, he said. Along the river, the way it looks in the morning when the mist comes off the water, the sound of it at night. He paused. That probably sounds foolish. It sounds like belonging somewhere, Emma said, which is not foolish at all. I think it might be one of the best things a person can do. He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that she could not quite name but that felt warm and serious at once, and then he stood up from the small desk with a slight creak of wood and said he ought to get back before dark, and he thanked her for the conversation, and he went. Emma sat at her teacher's desk for some time after he left, looking at the copy of Roughing It and thinking about belonging somewhere, and about a man who loved a piece of land along a river, and about the particular quality of his voice when he said he loved it, and she thought that she might be in some early, tentative form of trouble, the good kind, the kind that makes you sit very still and pay careful attention to what your own heart is saying. May arrived with its heat and its thunderstorms, and Clayton Barker became, by increments, a presence in Emma Merritt's life. He came to Sunday service. He had attended before, but she had never noticed, which said more about her previous state of preoccupation than about his attendance, and they had taken to sitting near each other and walking out together afterward, talking as they went. He had come to supper at the Merritt house twice, having been invited by Harold with the cheerful directness of a father who recognizes a good man and sees no reason to waste time about it. Margaret Merritt observed him across her supper table with the attentive patience of a woman taking an accurate measurement, and what she measured apparently satisfied her, because after the second supper, she told Emma in the kitchen while they washed dishes that Mr. Barker had good hands and a straight back and listened when Harold talked without watching the clock, which she considered reliable indicators of character. You like him, Emma said. I think you like him, Margaret said. I think you have liked him for some weeks and have been trying to be sensible about it. Is being sensible wrong? Being sensible is never wrong, her mother said. Being so sensible that you talk yourself out of something real is a different matter. Emma dried a plate and thought about this. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-May, Clayton asked her if she would like to ride out to the river bend and see the property. He said it plainly, without elaboration or nervousness, in the way he said most things, but there was something underneath the plainness that was asking a different and larger question, which Emma understood perfectly. "I would like that very much," she said. They rode out on a Saturday when the sun was warm, and the air smelled of cedar and river water. Captain Herbey Gelding kept easy pace with Clayton's horse, a big gray quarter horse named August. The land east of town was beautiful in its spare, particular way, broad and open, with the river cutting through it in long silver curves lined with live oaks and cottonwoods that threw good shade. The Barker property sat in a bend of the river where the land rose slightly and then leveled into a good flat expanse of grazing land, and the house he had built there was modest but solid, made of cedar and limestone in the way of the country, with a wide front porch that faced the river and caught the morning light. Emma sat on her horse and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It's a good house," she said finally. "It will be," Clayton said. "It needs work. I've been doing it room by room as I have time and material." "What does it need?" "Curtains," he said, and he said it with such absolute seriousness that Emma laughed, which was the first time she had laughed with complete abandon since before the wedding, and the sound of it surprised her slightly, as if she had found something she had misplaced and forgot she was looking for. He showed her the property, the grazing land where his longhorns moved in their slow, indifferent way, the small horse pasture where he was running 4-quarter horses he was training for sale, the kitchen garden that was modest and functional but clearly tended by a man who understood what things needed without necessarily understanding what they could be with more attention. He showed her the interior of the house, which was clean and spare and smelled of cedar and saddle leather and wood smoke, with a kitchen that had a good iron stove and a table big enough for 4, and a sitting room with 2 chairs and bookshelves that were full enough to tell her something important about him. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, history mostly, some natural history, a Bible that was worn in a way that meant it was read rather than displayed, 2 or 3 novels including Washington Irving and a Dickens. "You read more than I expected," she said. "People don't expect ranchers to read," he said from behind her. "I didn't mean it that way," Emma said. "I meant you mentioned on the drive once that you spent years on the trail. I just thought perhaps there hadn't been much time. On the trail you have the evenings," he said, "and the reading you do on the trail stays with you in a way that other kinds of reading don't, because there's nothing competing with it." Emma turned from the bookshelf and found him closer than she had realized, the room being not large, and they were standing perhaps 3 feet apart in the light from the single window, and something shifted between them the way things shift when 2 people have been moving carefully toward each other for several weeks and have arrived, without quite agreeing to it, at a place where the careful movement has to become something more deliberate or stop entirely. "Mr. Barker," Emma said. "Clayton," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "Clayton," she said. "Miss Merritt," he said, and then Emma. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sat in the quiet room between them like something placed gently on a table, offered rather than demanded. "I want to be honest with you about something," Emma said, "because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve careful handling." "All right," he said. "I was very hurt by what happened in April," she said. "Not just the mortification of it, though that was considerable, but the sense that I had misjudged something fundamentally. That I had given careful attention and still gotten it wrong. It made me wonder whether my own judgment was reliable." "That's understandable," Clayton said. "What I want to say," Emma continued, "is that I have spent the past month paying very careful attention to you, and my judgment is telling me something that I think I should say aloud before I think better of it." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "My judgment tells me that you are honest," Emma said, "and that you are kind in the plain way, the way that doesn't make a performance of itself. And that you pay attention to things most people overlook, and that you are serious about the things that deserve seriousness. And my judgment tells me that whatever I am beginning to feel when I am in the same room as you is probably not a mistake, and I would like very much not to spend the next several weeks talking myself out of it in the name of being sensible. The silence that followed this was not the awful silence of the church. It was the other kind, the kind that is full rather than empty. "Emma," Clayton said. His voice was quiet and very deliberate. "I have thought about you every day since that Sunday morning when you walked out of that church with your head up and your flowers in your hand. I watched you walk the length of that aisle and I thought, there is a woman with more dignity than the room deserves, and I have not been able to stop thinking about you since. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean. So when I tell you that what I am feeling is also not a mistake, I need you to know I mean it as plainly as I know how." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and then she took the single step that closed the distance between them, and she put her hand against his jaw, the left side, where the old scar ran, and he put his hand over hers and held it there. And they stood in the cedar-smelling room with the river light in the window and stayed like that for a moment that was simple and complete and more eloquent than anything either of them had said. He kissed her gently, the way a serious man kisses a serious woman, not tentatively but not urgently either, with the full weight of intent behind it, unhurried, honest. Emma felt the thing in the center of her chest that had been a knot since April ease itself slowly loose. They rode back to town in the late afternoon, with the sun throwing long shadows ahead of them on the road, and Emma felt something she had not felt in months, the particular peace of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, with exactly the right person. June in Caldwell Creek was full and warm, and Emma Merritt and Clayton Barker were no longer a subject of careful social observation, but a straightforward fact. They were seen together often enough, and with enough comfortable familiarity that the town had absorbed them as a unit with the efficient adaptability that small towns apply to new realities. Mrs. Cleary at the dry goods store told anyone who asked that it was the most sensible outcome of the whole Hutchins disaster, and since Mrs. Cleary's opinion carried considerable weight in Caldwell Creek, this framing settled the matter. Harold Merritt asked Clayton Barker to stay after supper one evening in late June, and had a conversation with him in the sitting room while Margaret and Emma were in the kitchen. A conversation that lasted 20 minutes and that neither man would recount in full afterward, but which Harold ended by shaking Clayton's hand with both of his and saying, with complete satisfaction, that he considered the matter settled. What matter exactly had not yet been formally asked, but Emma understood when her father came into the kitchen with that particular expression, the expression of a man whose instincts about another man have been confirmed by further examination, that the formal asking was not far off. It came on a July evening, a Sunday, when the heat had softened to something bearable in the late hour, and they were sitting on the porch of the Merritt house, with the stars coming out thick and close above the mesquite. They had been talking, as they often talked, about everything and nothing. A book Emma had finished, a foal that had been born on Clayton's property that week, a letter Harold had received from a former student who had gone east for college, a rumor about the railroad possibly extending a spur line toward the county. Clayton fell quiet in a way that was slightly different from his usual comfortable quiet, and Emma waited, and he turned on the porch bench and looked at her with the focused directness that she had come to understand was how he approached things that mattered. "Emma," he said, "I would like you to marry me." She looked at him. The stars were very bright. A mockingbird was singing somewhere in the mesquite in the way mockingbirds do in the summer evenings, cycling through a dozen borrowed songs as if trying to find the right one. "I would like that too," she said. "I would like that very much." He took her hand, both hands, and held them in his, and looked at her with an expression that was private and serious and full of something she could only think of as intention, a man looking at his future with clear eyes and no reservation. "I won't promise you a life without difficulty," he said. "The land is good, but it's also hard, and there will be years that are lean and years when things break and years when nothing goes right no matter how much work you put in. But I will be honest with you always, and I will never make you feel small, and I will spend every day trying to be worth what you're giving me." Emma felt something rise in her chest that was not quite tears but was in the same neighborhood. "That is a better proposal than most," she said, though her voice was slightly unsteady now, which she allowed. "It's the only one I have," he said. "It is exactly enough," she said. He brought the ring out of his vest pocket. It was a simple band with a small garnet set in it, dark red and clear, and he told her it had been his mother's, from Jefferson, which was all that needed saying about it. She held out her left hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it in the starlight and thought about how strange and right it was, that this was where the morning in April had brought her, that the worst humiliation of her life had been the door through which this arrived. They were married in September. The wedding was smaller this time, held at the Merritt house under a canopy of live oak branches, with wild sunflowers and late summer bluebonnets tucked into mason jars along the table. Reverend Calloway presided with an expression of genuine relief and warmth that suggested he was glad to preside over a ceremony that involved fewer surprises than the last occasion on which this particular bride had required his services. There were perhaps 30 guests, the people who mattered rather than the whole territory. And Harold Merritt gave his daughter away with the steady, glowing calm of a man who knows he is watching something exactly right happen in front of him. Margaret had made the cake, 3 layers of yellow cake with a buttercream icing, and she had put small sprigs of rosemary between the layers because she believed rosemary meant remembrance, and she wanted this one to be remembered properly. Emma wore a dress of ivory cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar, made by the milliner's wife who was also a seamstress of considerable talent, and she carried a bouquet of sunflowers, not bluebonnets, which was a deliberate choice she did not explain to anyone because it did not require explanation. Clayton wore his best clothes and had his hair combed, and stood at the end of the aisle formed by the 2 rows of chairs in the Merritt yard, with the expression of a man who has thought carefully about this moment, and is exactly where he intended to be. When Emma came toward him through the September morning, with the sunlight catching the garnet on her finger and her father's hand at her arm, something moved across Clayton's face that was not quite composure, and several of the guests would remember it later as one of the more moving things they had seen in some time. Reverend Calloway read from 1 Corinthians and from Ruth, and he asked if they took each other, and they said they did. And he said, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." And they looked at each other when he said it with the private communication of people who share a context that makes the words carry additional weight. Emma pressed her palm flat against Clayton's chest, feeling his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt, and he put his hands on either side of her face with the gentleness that was his natural register. And when he kissed her, the 30 guests clapped, and Margaret Merritt wept in the contained, dignified way of a woman who has earned her tears. And Harold Merritt blew his nose loudly into his handkerchief and looked at the sky, and Dora Blaine from the cafe, who had been invited because she had made no fewer than 3 discreet and warm overtures to Emma in the aftermath of April, said to Mrs. Cleary beside her that it was, simply, the best thing. They ate and drank and talked through the afternoon, and in the early evening Clayton helped Emma onto August. She would learn his horse, and he had already become comfortable on Captain, and they rode out together east along the river road toward the property, toward the house with the wide porch that faced the water and the bookshelves and the kitchen that needed more attention and the curtains that still needed putting up. And the last of the September light lay flat in gold across the land and turned the river to copper, and Emma Merritt rode beside her husband and thought that the territory had never looked so beautiful in her life. The first year of marriage was, as Clayton had promised, not without difficulty. It was not without joy either, and the joy was larger than the difficulty by a considerable margin, but it was honest, and Emma had found that she preferred honest life to comfortable illusions. The Longhorn market softened in the fall, as cattle markets sometimes do, and Clayton sold what he had planned to hold, and held what he had planned to sell, and came out of it with less than he'd hoped, but more than he needed, which he reported to Emma at the supper table with the matter-of-fact equanimity of a man who has learned to be at peace with outcomes he cannot fully control. Emma, who had been teaching 3 days a week again at the schoolhouse, Harold's health had improved through the summer with the relief of having Clayton to share the practical burdens of the property maintenance, and he was back most days but preferred Emma's assistance, had her own small income which she managed with the efficiency of a woman who grew up knowing that margins matter. They were not wealthy. They were solvent and comfortable and deliberately organized toward something better, and that was enough. In the winter evenings they read by the fire, 2 chairs pulled close together, and sometimes Emma read aloud, and sometimes Clayton did, and sometimes they read in companionable silence with the dog, a black and tan hound they had acquired in October from a neighboring farmer whose litter had been too large, at their feet. Emma had put up curtains in every window of the house, cream-colored cotton curtains that let in the morning light and moved in the afternoon breeze, and she had planted a kitchen garden in the spring that was already looking, by summer, like it might rival her mother's. Clayton watched her in the garden sometimes from the porch, the way she moved along the rows with careful attention, the way she talked to the plants without any self-consciousness, the way she straightened and pushed her hair back with her wrist and tilted her face toward the sun, and felt something settle deeper in him each time, a bedrock feeling, an accumulated weight of rightness that grew rather than diminishing. He told her once, on a morning when she had come in from the garden and sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands dirty and her cheeks flushed from the sun, that he could not fully explain the particular satisfaction of watching her exist in the spaces of this house and this land, except that it was the closest thing to the word home he had ever been able to put a feeling to. Emma took his hand across the table and held it and said, "Good. Because I intend to exist in these spaces for a very long time." The following spring, in the March of 1884, Emma told him in the same kitchen, at the same table, with the same morning light coming through the curtains, that she was expecting their first child. Clayton was very still for a moment in the way he was still when something moved through him that he had not yet organized into words, and then he reached across the table and took her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that was full and unguarded in a way she had only seen a handful of times and treasured each one. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling very well," she said, laughing slightly at the immediate practical direction of his concern. "I am feeling considerably better than very well. I am feeling rather extraordinary." He came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her with his arms around her and his chin at the top of her head, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was the correct response to the situation. Harold and Margaret Merritt received the news with joy that was almost indistinguishable from relief, Harold embracing his daughter, and then embracing Clayton with equal vigor, and Margaret sitting down rather suddenly in her kitchen chair and pressing her hands together and looking upward with the expression of a woman having a private conversation with Providence. The pregnancy was unremarkable in the best sense. Emma was healthy and determined, and absolutely refused to surrender her garden or her teaching or her evening reading on the grounds that she was expecting a child, not recovering from a catastrophe, and she continued all 3 with some adjustments through the summer. She did let Clayton take over the heavier elements of the garden maintenance without making him feel he was intruding, which required some diplomatic management from both of them, and she was home from the schoolhouse by early afternoon rather than late, which was a reasonable concession. Clayton built a small cradle in the evenings through August and September, in the barn where the light was good, from cedar that he had milled from a tree that had come down in the spring storms, and Emma came to watch him sometimes and sat on an overturned bucket and read or talked or simply watched his hands shape the wood. And there was something in the quiet industry of those evenings that she thought she might love as much as anything they had shared. The child came in November, on a cold, clear morning when the Guadalupe was running high from the autumn rains, and the cedar waxwings were moving through in their bright, chattering flocks. He was a boy, healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair and his father's disposition toward regarding the world with steady brown eyes, which he demonstrated within the first hour of his life. They named him Henry Harold Barker Henry for a great-grandfather on Clayton's side whom Clayton had respected, and Harold for Emma's father, who received this information with a dignity that was thoroughly undone by the fact that his eyes immediately filled with tears, which he managed, just barely, to hold back until he had left the room. Harold Merritt held his grandson for the first time and sat very still with the baby against his chest and was quiet for a long time, and then he looked at Emma and said, "Well, I believe this is my favorite student," and Emma laughed from her bed and said he always said that, and he said, "This time I mean it in a different way." Henry Harold Barker grew through the winter and into his first spring with the particular determination of a healthy child who has decided to master the world, and is proceeding systematically toward that goal. He had his father's quietness and his mother's focus, which together made him a child who watched things very carefully before he attempted them, which meant that when he did attempt them he usually succeeded, which was a pattern they recognized from both sides of his parentage and found entirely appropriate. Caldwell Creek grew through those years as Clayton had predicted it would. The railroad spur came through in 1885, which brought more people and more commerce, and the particular disruption of a community in transition between what it was and what it would become. Emma watched it with the mixed feelings of someone who had come to love a place in its particular form, and understood intellectually that places cannot be preserved like insects in amber, however much you might wish it. Clayton managed the transition in his practical way. He contracted to supply beef to the railroad construction camp in 1884 and used the income to expand the herd. And by 1886, the Barker operation east of town was one of the more established small ranches in the county. Not large by territory standards, but sound and growing and entirely his own, which had always been the goal. Sheriff Dobbs retired in the spring of 1886 and was replaced by a younger man named Marcus Webb, who had come up from San Antonio and had a reputation for fair dealing and a steady temper, which were the two qualities the county agreed mattered most in a sheriff. Emma taught his two children in the fall term and found them bright and reasonably well behaved, which she told their father, and he told her it was entirely his wife's doing, and she said she would take his word for it. Gerald Hutchins passed through town once, in the summer of 1885, on his way through from San Antonio to somewhere further west. Emma saw him on the main street through the window of the cafe where she was having her Thursday coffee. He had aged more than 3 years should have required, and he was alone, and he walked past the cafe window without looking in. She felt nothing particular, not the old anger, not the residual hurt, not even satisfaction, which was probably the healthiest outcome possible. She drank her coffee and read the paper, and when Clayton came to find her at noon, she told him about it simply, as a piece of information, and he listened and said he was glad she was all right, and she said she was entirely all right, and they walked home together along the river road, and that was the end of Gerald Hutchins in her life. In the fall of 1886, Emma told Clayton she was expecting again. Henry was nearly 2 and was conducting himself at a run throughout the house and the barn and the garden with a focused energy that suggested the universe had been specifically designed for his investigation. Emma made the announcement at the same kitchen table at the same morning hour, which had apparently become their kitchen's dedicated setting for important news, and Clayton received it with the same quality of careful stillness and then quiet joy that he had brought to it the first time, which she had been counting on and was entirely satisfied to receive. This time it was a girl. She came in April, which seemed appropriate. April had been a month of significant events in the Barker family's personal history, and this one was the best of them by a wide margin. They named her Rose Margaret, Rose for the prairie roses that had been in Emma's bouquet on the day that had started everything, and Margaret for Emma's mother, who received this with considerably less restraint than Harold had managed 2 years earlier, and simply sat down and cried with straightforward happiness, and made no effort whatsoever to hide it. Henry, presented with his sister, examined her with his characteristic careful assessment, and then looked at his mother and said small, which was accurate and which Emma confirmed. Rose Margaret Barker was from the first a different order of creature from her brother, not quieter, not louder, but differently directed, with an interest in everything emotional and social that balanced her brother's interest in everything practical and investigable. She watched faces the way Henry watched mechanisms, with the same focused attention and the same drive toward understanding, and it was clear very early that she had inherited her mother's gift for reading a room and her father's gift for patience, which was a combination that would serve her well. The years settled into the comfortable rhythm of a life well made. Emma returned to teaching full-time when Rose was old enough to spend her mornings with Margaret, who had retired from her own housekeeping ambitions, and was delighted to have a reason to come east to the river property 3 mornings a week. Harold's health had continued to improve to the point where he was back at the schoolhouse most days, and he and Emma shared the teaching with an ease that came from years of understanding each other's methods. Clayton ran the ranch with the same steady, intelligent care he had given it from the beginning, expanding when expansion made sense and holding steady when it did not, and the River Bend property had become what he had intended it to become: a good place, solid and alive, that bore the marks of people who had loved it. On a September evening in 1887, 5 years after the wedding, Emma sat on the front porch of the house with the river visible through the live oaks in the last of the light, and listened to Henry explain to his sister, with great authority, exactly why the particular bird calling in the distance was a chuckwill's widow rather than a whippoorwill, which was information he had received from his grandfather, and was transmitting with a fidelity that was almost comical. Clayton came out of the house and sat in the chair beside Emma and handed her a cup of coffee and looked at his 2 children on the porch steps. "He sounds like Harold," he said. "He is exactly like Harold," Emma said. "Which is the best thing he could possibly be." They sat and listened to the river and the birds and the children, and the evening settled around them in that particular way that good evenings have when they know they are being appreciated. "Clayton," Emma said, "do you ever think about that morning, April of '82? He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about it?" "I think about the way you looked when you turned away from him," he said. "I think about the way you didn't fall apart, even when you had every right to. I think about standing up and not being entirely certain what I was going to say, and then it coming out so simply, and it being the right thing." "It was entirely the right thing," Emma said. "I think about what wouldn't have happened," he said, "if I'd stayed seated, and it makes me certain every time that standing up was the single most important thing I ever did." Emma reached over and took his hand and laced her fingers through his, the garnet ring catching the last of the light. "Do you know what I thought?" she said, "when I looked at you across that church?" "What?" "I thought, there is a man who is not afraid of doing the right thing in front of everyone," she said. And I did not know then what that would mean, but I knew it was something I had never seen before, and I thought that whatever came next, that was worth something. He squeezed her hand and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. "More than something," Emma said, "as it turned out." Henry had exhausted his ornithological authority, and had moved on to showing Rose the correct way to throw a stick for the dog, which involved a great deal of physical demonstration, and some fraternal condescension that Rose received with the patient, observant expression she had brought to most things since her first month of life. The dog retrieved the stick with enthusiasm. Rose took it from him and threw it with considerable effectiveness for a 2-year-old, and Henry's condescension reorganized itself into surprise and then reluctant approval. "She is going to be formidable," Clayton said. "She already is," Emma said. The river caught the last colors of the evening and then lost them, going silver and then dark as the sky deepened, and the first stars came out above the live oaks. Henry caught a firefly and held it cupped in his hands and brought it to show his parents with the reverence of a child bringing a genuine treasure, and Clayton cupped his own hands around his son's, and they opened them together and watched the small light rise and blink and drift upward into the dark. "Again?" Henry asked. "There will be others," Clayton said. "There always are, if you pay attention." Henry accepted this with the particular gravity of a child receiving wisdom he intends to carry forward, and went back to the yard to look, and Rose toddled after him, and the dog followed Rose. Emma leaned her head against Clayton's shoulder. He put his arm around her and they sat together in the dark of the September porch and listened to their children in the yard and watched the fireflies blink in the live oaks and heard the river below in the trees, moving always in the same direction toward the same destination with the same certain patience. "I am happy," Emma said. It was a simple declaration, made without drama, the way she said things that were entirely true. "So am I," Clayton said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and held her there in the warm September dark, and the children laughed in the yard, and the dog barked at a firefly, and the river went on, and the stars went on, and the evening went on being what it was, full and present and exactly sufficient, and more than enough for any life. 3 years further on, in the spring of 1890, Henry Barker was 5 years old and had begun attending his grandfather's schoolhouse, where Harold Merritt sat him in the second row and gave him no special treatment whatsoever except for the quality of Harold's teaching itself, which was the best treatment he could have offered. Henry received arithmetic and spelling and reading with the same systematic approach he gave everything, and Harold reported to Emma and Clayton at the supper table that the boy had a mind that was going to require some careful tending, and a great deal of stimulation to keep it from making mischief, which Clayton said he took as a compliment, and Harold said was entirely intended as one. Rose had begun talking with the comprehensive fluency of a child who has been listening to adult conversation for years and has absorbed rather more of it than anyone suspected. And she followed Emma through the kitchen garden in the mornings before school, with a running commentary on the state of the tomatoes and the behavior of the barn cat, and the relative merits of various cloud formations that was so relentless and so earnest that Emma sometimes had to excuse herself behind the bean poles to laugh in private. It was in this same spring that Clayton came home from town one afternoon with news that Aldous Hutchins had died peacefully, of old age, at the property he had held for 40 years, and that his estate was being settled. Gerald, who had never come back to the territory in any meaningful way, had received his reduced inheritance through a bank in San Antonio, and the main Hutchins property was being sold at auction in June. "Are you all right?" Clayton asked Emma when he told her. "I am perfectly all right," Emma said. She was at the stove and did not stop what she was doing. Aldous Hutchins was a proud and difficult man who was entirely undone by his son, and he deserved better from his family. I feel sorry for him if I feel anything at all. Nothing for Gerald. Gerald made his choices in April of '82, Emma said. She turned and looked at her husband. And they were, on reflection, the best choices he ever made for anyone, including me, so I find it genuinely difficult to resent them. Clayton smiled at her then, the full smile, the one that took his whole face and transformed it, which she had been the primary recipient of for 8 years now, and which had never once failed to make something warm unfurl in the center of her chest. "You are an extraordinary woman," he said. "I am a practical woman," Emma said, "which in the right circumstances amounts to the same thing." The Hutchins property sold to a family from East Texas named Greer, who had 3 teenage sons and a wife who grew up in a farming family and knew what she was looking at when she looked at good land. Emma called on them the week after they arrived, with a pound cake and a copy of the county's best practical almanac, and Mrs. Greer opened the door and shook her hand and said, "I was told you were the person to know in this county." And Emma said, "Whoever told you that was doing you a kindness?" And they got along entirely from that moment forward. Harold Merritt retired from the schoolhouse in the fall of 1890, at the age of 62, on the grounds that his knees had held an opinion about the matter, and he had decided to defer to them. He came to this decision with the same philosophical ease with which he had approached most of the significant junctures of his life, and he and Margaret settled into the quiet life of a couple who have earned their leisure and know exactly what to do with it. He spent his mornings reading, and his afternoons in the garden, and his evenings writing the natural history of the Guadalupe River country that he had been gathering material for over the course of 30 years of living beside it. Emma took the schoolhouse fully into her own keeping, which had been the natural direction of things for some time, and felt less like a transition than a formalization. The school had grown as the town had grown, and she now had 2 rooms instead of 1 and a younger teacher for the upper grades, a woman named Alice Carpenter who had come from Austin and who was smart and eager and absolutely willing to receive Emma's accumulated knowledge of how to manage 25 children across 5 grades without losing either her temper or her enthusiasm, which was the central skill the job required. Life in Caldwell Creek in the early 1890s had a different quality from the 1880s. The territory was filling in, the frontier's particular wildness receding into something more administered and more settled, which was progress and loss at once in the way that most progress tends to be. Clayton felt it on the land. There were fewer years when something genuinely unpredictable happened and more years when you could plan a season in advance and have the plan hold. He was not sure how he felt about this. He said to Emma one night that he sometimes missed the sense that the land was larger than anything you could tame, and Emma said that she thought the land was still larger than that. They had just gotten better at forgetting it, and he said that was probably true and probably the point. Henry was 12 in 1896 and had grown into a serious, curious boy who spent his Saturdays on horseback with his father learning the ranch in the systematic way his father had taught him. Not by being given it, but by being shown it, piece by piece, and asked to understand each piece before moving to the next. He had his father's facility with animals and his mother's facility with language, which made him a boy who could talk to anyone about anything, and also ride anything that moved, which was a useful combination in the territory. Rose was 10, and had inherited Emma's love of books and her father's love of the natural world, and had developed, from these 2 things, an interest in the natural sciences that neither of them had specifically planned for, but which both of them were entirely delighted to support. She had filled 3 notebooks with careful observations of the birds and plants and insects of the River Bend property, in handwriting that was already better than most adults, with small accurate drawings alongside the written notes that were so good they made Harold Merritt, who had been an occasional naturalist himself, tell Emma privately that the girl had a genuine gift. On a December evening in 1896, with the first real cold of winter outside and the fire warm in the sitting room, Emma sat in her chair with Rose reading beside her and Henry and Clayton at the table, working through a mathematical problem that had been set at school, and which had escalated from homework into a project of some independent ambition. The dog, their 3rd dog now, the first 2 having lived full and cherished lives, was at Henry's feet, and the curtains were drawn against the dark, and the lamp cast its warm circle, and it was an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every particular except for the fact of being exactly what it was. Emma looked around the room. At Clayton's bent head as he showed Henry something on the paper, at Rose's profile in the lamplight, absorbed and still, at the familiar arrangement of the room, the books, the curtains, the worn, comfortable chairs that had replaced the original 2, at everything that had been built here, year by year, with 2 people's attention and care and love. She thought about a morning in April of 1882, when she had stood in a white dress in a doorway and the world had closed a door, and then, improbably, opened another one. She thought about a man standing up in the back of a church and saying 5 words, "Let me take you home," and the way those 5 words had been, though she could not have known it then, among the most consequential words anyone would ever say to her. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, and about how Clayton had said that once, years ago, about this land and this river, and about how she understood it now in a way she had not understood anything when she was 24 and standing in a doorway with bluebonnets in her hands. She understood it as the feeling in this room, right now, her husband's voice explaining something patient and clear to her son, her daughter's hand moving across a page in the lamplight, the fire warm, the night outside cold and full of stars, and this room the center of it all, solid and known and earned. She understood it as Clayton. He looked up from the table at that moment, as he sometimes did when she was thinking about him, as if the thinking itself were loud enough to hear across a room. He looked at her across the sitting room with the steadiness that had been his characteristic expression from the very first moment she had looked at him with real attention, on the bench of a working wagon driving east on an April road. She smiled at him. He smiled back, the full one, the real one, the one that was entirely for her. Henry said something triumphant about the mathematics problem. Rose looked up from her book. The dog woke from his doze and lifted his head to assess the situation, and then put it down again. The fire settled in the grate. Emma Merritt Barker looked at her life and found it, in every particular that mattered, exactly right. Not perfect. She had given up the idea of perfect sometime in the spring of 1882 and never retrieved it, and she thought this was one of the better decisions she had ever made. Not without its years of difficulty and its ordinary grief and its seasons of hard work and thin margins. Not without loss. Harold Merritt died in the spring of 1898, quietly, in his own bed, with Margaret beside him, after finishing the final chapter of his natural history of the river country, which Emma would see published in a small Texas printing in 1899, and which Henry would keep on his own bookshelf for the rest of his life. Not without the complicated ongoing process of two people building a life together, which required constant attention and occasional repair, and the willingness to choose each other again, deliberately, every day. But exactly right, which was better than perfect, being a real thing rather than an imagined one. She picked up her book and read, and the evening continued, and the fire kept burning, and the river went on below the live oaks in the dark, and inside the house on the river bend, everything was warm and still and full, and the night settled gently over the territory like a blessing over something that had been worked for and was worth it. In the years that came after, and there were many good years, patient and accumulating, each one building on the last, Emma would sometimes find herself standing at the window that faced the road, the window with the cream-colored curtains that moved in the breeze, and she would think about the particular thread of chance that had run through everything. The cruel luck of a morning in April, the improbable gift of a man who stood up when everyone else sat still, the long and patient unfolding of what came after. She had taught her students for 20 years that history is not a line but a river. It bends and doubles back and moves through places you did not expect, and sometimes the places where it curves most sharply are where the most important things get deposited. She believed this more fully with every year she lived. Clayton said to her once, when they were old enough to speak with the full authority of a long life behind them, that the best thing he had ever done was stand up in the back of that church. That every good thing in his life traced itself to those 5 words, and the yes she had given him later, in the river light of his sitting room with his hands holding hers. Emma said that she thought the best thing she had ever done was keep her head up walking down that aisle, that all of it, all of the best of it, had required that she not fall apart before help arrived. He said she had always been stronger than the situation required. She said he had always shown up exactly when it mattered. They were sitting on the porch, as they did in the evenings now that the children were grown and the house was quieter, and the porch had become their primary territory for the business of being together. The river still ran below the live oaks. The stars were still thick and close over the mesquite. The mockingbird was still singing in the dark, or not the same mockingbird, of course, but another one and another one after that, the song continuing even as the singers changed, which was how it was with songs worth singing. Clayton took Emma's hand in both of his, the way he had that first time on the porch in the dark with the garnet ring new on her finger, and held it the same way, not gripping, not clutching, just holding, the way you hold something you are certain of. "Emma," he said. "Clayton," she said. They looked at the stars and listened to the river and the mockingbird, and needed nothing else, and were everything to each other and were home.